Welcome to another episode of Four Guys Talking About AI. I'm here with my good buddies, John Gerard, Greg Sterling, and Neil Polacek. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Hey, guys, what's happening?
What's going on, guys?
It's the all black edition here.
That's right.
All right, well, cool. So let's kick it off this week. We've got some interesting stories. ServiceNow, their stock is down 50% this year, despite solid earnings. And the question is this the death of SaaS? Is that becoming a real thing? Or is the market just punishing anything that isn't AI first? We'll dig into that a little bit because ServiceNow is a very manually driven company that has software associated with it, but a very large workforce. Meanwhile, Claude is making moves. Anthropic's chatbot just became the true workspace assistant, integrating directly into Slack, Figma, and Canva. And Google's Gemini 3 now browses the web for you inside of Chrome, blurring the lines between search, workflow, and personal assistant. So we'll get into that. And there's tension in the market with AI products getting smarter. Trust in them is failing. The Pentagon wants to use Anthropic for surveillance. Anthropic is saying no. So the real question is, does AI scale if trust doesn't? So let's dig into the first story here. ServiceNow stock is down 50% this year, despite solid earnings. And so the question is this the death of SaaS? If this is like a new wave in how business is evolving? John, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting one. I think companies like ServiceNow on the SaaS side are getting punished right now, but not for, in many cases, the right reasons. So I think a lot of the fear that we assume is associated with AI and SaaS businesses is that AI is going to cause it so you don't need ServiceNow anymore. And the truth is actually a little bit more nuanced, a little bit different than that. Systems of record that help large companies operate in regimented, disciplined ways are going to be important for the long term. Now, there are examples of companies saying, you know what, I'm not paying the Salesforce license anymore or the ServiceNow license anymore because we're going to build that internally. And that is happening, and it's going to happen over time. There's also an erosion of the integrator layer that's happening right now. So if you think about something, even as something simple like a HubSpot CRM, it takes a bit to set it up. I had this experience just last week where I was trying to set up HubSpot CRM. I was like, they must have an MCP server by now. And they do, but it's terrible. Integrators who spend 3 weeks, 6 weeks setting up a HubSpot project for their customers are going to disappear 6 months from now when that HubSpot MCP server is good. Because what happens is I will go in and say, I need HubSpot set up in a way that does this, this, and this. And the AI will go in and take care of that via that MCP link. So the SaaS businesses are under threat, but for different reasons than we assume. And I'll give you real quickly the main thing that's going on. It's the second point you mentioned. Everything that's not AI is getting punished. So a couple of very well-known investors, including Bill Gurley, have mentioned very recently, been on record saying this is the most binary investment market they have ever seen. That companies that are doing extremely well, growing at paces that would have given them, a 10x multiple on the last valuation from their last round just a few years ago, can't raise money because they aren't AI first. All the dollars are going into these companies that are growing, some of them 50, 60% month over month, even at scales of $1 million MRR, $10 million MRR. And there is absolutely no attention being paid to everybody else. I think that the investment market is basically creating a whole bunch of SaaS zombies, and what happens from here around that is anybody's guess.
Well, one of the things you mentioned in previous episodes that are so compelling is that with the ability to use MCP servers and create customized software for your workflow in a company, the way you put it was you're creating software for one, right? Instead of this one-to-many kind of SaaS model. And that completely flips the whole SaaS business model on its head, because then you can put together whatever software applications through an MCP server and stitch it together in a way that really services your workflow as a business.
What I think is really fascinating is that whole integrator level. I mean, there are a lot of integrators out there. They're IT consultants. There are hundreds of thousands, if not, of IT integrators that you're telling me in 6 months won't be needed. That's a really fundamental story. Where do they go? What do
But
they do?
they will shift to become MCP configurators.
Yeah,
But
They will.
Right.
It's the same story as AI lawyers that we've talked about. Like, it'll enable the people who are really good at this to do 10 times as much work. The economics of that might be that it also that it there's so much demand for setting up these systems effectively. As the cost comes down, the the demand rises to cover it, and so you just get more people setting up more of these systems in the short term.
Yeah.
I think in the longer term, the threat is this enterprise app for a customer of one challenge that probably is the biggest threat to SaaS over the longer term.
But I suspect you will have a class of people who emerge that are pitching this idea that we can build a much more user-friendly and tailored tool that will do whatever your needs are, and pay me some money up front. I will configure that for you, and then maybe be on call if there's some problems.
And by the way, I'll also say this, so some of the incumbents, like let's call it like the Salesforce, are actually going to hide behind security concerns and not expose some of this stuff on the MCP side. This is my guess, because they are so reliant on the integrator layer, and they're so reliant on that for sales, that if they're too disruptive to those friendlies, their own business can get
Self-destructive.
Yeah.
Right.
So I suspect that opens the door. This is innovator's dilemma kind of stuff. That opens the door for brand new CRMs, probably not HubSpot, probably somebody we haven't heard of yet, or a third tier like a Pipedrive, to
Right.
come in and say, you know what, we're the AI first MCP oriented CRM, and all of a sudden just capture the entire bottom of the market.
Well, so the small business market, I think, is which is elastic and can be defined in various ways. We were talking before we started recording. I was saying there's still a role for SaaS companies that have those relationships where there's trust involved, or some version of trust involved, and they are the ones that are bringing these AI capabilities to small businesses. Now, unless or until you have, Neil can talk about MSPs, but unless or until you have somebody who can displace that trust, right? Who can win the confidence of a small business. I can do this for you. I'm cheaper, and it's going to work. You're going to have enterprises defecting, but this massive small businesses will still be dependent on these traditional software vendors who are
you need for a managed service in this. Like, you're going to have to be the advisor who helps people say, not only will I help you adopt this technology, but I'm going to sell you the outcomes. This is going to help you grow your business, and this is how it's going to grow your business. And then they implement the systems and show them what their systems are, so it's fully transparent. And then they show them the growth, and they're on the hook for that growth.
I think those MSPs have a really big opportunity with all this stuff, because they can finally play a more active role in growing the business, not just, oh, my LAN isn't working, like they can actually stitch these things together and become that new integration layer that you're talking about, John.
Yeah.
That could be really fundamental to these SMBs.
Yeah,
Really
and I
fun.
think that the kind of snapshot here is that as the costs for all this stuff go down, the possibilities for doing, enterprise level integrations at lower and lower levels of, scales of business becomes a reality. And by the way, that goes all the way down the stack into personal productivity, right? So now the individual worker is enabled to write simple scripts to help them do the things that they were otherwise relying on IT to do, or otherwise trying to source a simple SaaS, solution to do. So that goes all the way down to the individual, business person, somewhat tech savvy, sitting in the seat.
Well, let me give you a real example of this. Greg and I, in our other business, we built a chatbot. And one of the opportunities was to build it in a way that agencies could say, give me a list of the ice cream stores in Oakland, California. We found a partner who has that data. We actually did a little bit of work, and lo and behold, if you ask that chatbot for a list of ice cream stores in Oakland, California, it'll give you a list. And Greg and I are not programmers. The person who did it is not a programmer. They're not a software engineer, but lo and behold, it works.
Yeah, and you probably could have built that for $10,000 3 years ago, but it probably wouldn't have been worth considering that. And now you get to experiment with it for, virtually for free because it's accessible.
And it would have been rigid and it would have been limited in terms of what you can do. And now you can iterate on it just at the prompt level in natural language, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I feel proud we built this thing.
Yeah, totally. With Lovable, with Bolt, with Cursor, all these tools now, you can create this kind of capability. It's kind of amazing. And so this takes us to our next story, which is, Claude is making moves in this direction. Anthropic is the parent company. And they've created this true workspace assistant. They've integrated with Slack, Figma, Canva, many others. And Google's Gemini 3 now browses the web for you. That all is backdrop for personal assistant. And then this week has been the big story is Clawdbot. I don't know if you guys have heard of Clawdbot, but this is also a personal assistant that is more of a proactive assistant. It actually does things for you instead of being reactive.
CLAWD.
That's right.
CLAWD, yeah, exactly. So these personal assistants, Sean, that you're talking about are definitely on the rise, and whether it's work or personal assistants. And so, this is the trend that's starting to emerge, and it's coming up really quickly. A lot of it's really pretty easy to create these kinds of capabilities now. And the backdrop of all of that is our other story that we're going to talk about, which is trust. You have to invest a lot of trust in these systems in order for them to actually work. And, Greg, you've mentioned the CEO of Signal has, warned everybody, rightfully so, about connecting your personal data to these systems because
and your bank account and all that stuff.
Yeah, if you don't know what you're doing, you're ripe for getting hacked. So
and these systems are not totally secure either. I mean, I think that this is one of the critiques of the AI browsers is that they're vulnerable to hacking.
Aren't all these things we play on vulnerable to this hacking?
To varying degrees. I mean, most of it's a question of whether or not you get spoofed or you're a victim of phishing, which is on you, versus whether the system itself gets hacked and they get into the system.
Yeah.
If you don't have enough security wrapped around your Clawdbot, for example, and somebody creates a bot to go search that out and they find your bot, they can just get in there and start stealing data.
Well, and I think especially because at these early stages, there's so much kind of hackiness associated with making these things work. So, for example, for Clawdbot, or the thing I talked about last week that I was working on, which by the way, looks like Clawdbot is pretty much what I was working on. So maybe I'll pivot over to that. But you have to pierce the existing security protections in order for those to work. So, Apple, not surprisingly, has very stringent security on Macs around what can come in from the outside, and basically nothing can come in from the outside. There's a couple of gaps for like HTTP requests and when you're browsing the web. But these AI tools need to have bigger gaps so that you can call them from other places onto your machine. That's a problem, right? So if there's a gap now where an attacker can get on, instruct Clawdbot to go to my bank account and send them all my money, that could be an issue.
Yeah. And then also, the broader lens on that, or sort of the macro movements that are happening, is that the Pentagon wants to use Anthropic for surveillance. And again, Anthropic is Claude. So they're saying, no, we're not going to. They have a government contract with the Pentagon. So Greg, talk a little bit about that. What's happening?
Well, they already have a relationship with the Pentagon, and what they're arguing about is what the appropriate uses of the AI technology are. And they don't want the government to do autonomous warfare using AI. And they also are objecting, at least according to the Reuters report that I saw, to the use of their technology for domestic surveillance, which is happening right now. The Department of Homeland Security is doing various things in terms of domestic surveillance, which are kind of unprecedented in the United States. And so there's a question of the abuse of these technologies, which are very, very powerful. And then also, to what extent is that awareness penetrating to the consumer market or to the end customer, and how is that impacting their perceptions? So as one small example of that, so Google's released, we may have talked about this last week, personalized intelligence, which is their bid to essentially lock you in by getting you to connect all these apps to Gemini, Photos and Gmail and Search and maybe YouTube as well. They're going to
apps. They're apps.
Yeah, it's Google Apps, but they're gonna have all this data that is based on your activity, right? And then that's presumably going to make Gemini much more responsive and sticky. There's just 5 years ago, no problem, I would have been all over it. Cool, this is a great thing. Now, zero chance that I'm going to do this because I simply don't trust Google. And I may be an outlier, but I think there's a lot of Gallup polls and various surveys reflect that there is concern and fear about quote unquote big technology or big AI, and people, these companies are not doing enough to reassure the public that their technologies aren't going to be abused or that their data is safe. Safety and privacy have been secondary considerations, I think, in the public discussion.
I think underlying some of this privacy stuff is not just the threat of an enterprise abusing that information, but somehow the enterprise turning that over to the government to
of course
too.
Well, so, it's already happening.
But maybe in prior periods we weren't so worried about the government trying to step in to abuse that data, and we were worried
Definitely
about
not.
companies doing it. But now I think there's what's going on in our world today. These governments are now having a hand in putting their hand in the cookie jar too. And I think that's what's underlying some of this trust stuff. My opinion.
Almost like more than a hand in the cookie jar. It is the cookie jar. It is
like they're crawling inside the cookie jar.
And we've talked about Apple. Like, where's Apple in all of this? And interestingly, as we're talking about this, it could be that Apple's play is actually the privacy play. And, the anti, jump into this AI stuff so quickly. Like, here's your safe haven. Here's your data that's protected. It's always been their message. And maybe by slow rolling this, they can turn this into a competitive advantage to say, we didn't actually jump into all that stuff because we are the anti, steal company. We'll protect it.
They have definitely marketed privacy, and they've especially marketed privacy against Google and against Facebook. And, it's ironic that they chose Gemini to be the guts of the new Siri because that flies in the face of that representation. But you're absolutely right, Andy. That is their message and one of their differentiators in the market. And, Tim Cook has taken a beating recently because of his close alignment with some of the things that the U.S. is doing. And so that is eroding trust in Apple somewhat, but that's Apple's play for sure, is to be the most security and privacy conscious of these providers.
Yeah, and they're actually advantaged too just by being a consumer electronics brand that is stylish and hip. And most people, I think, don't care that AI isn't fully enabled on Apple devices right now. Like, that's not a buying concern in the same way that that its coolness is.
Clearly, as their most recent quarterly results show, they just knocked it out of the park, despite the fact that they haven't really delivered on their AI promises. They also announced that they have 2.5 billion users globally, which is a pretty big number.
Just the phone or across all their devices?
I think that was a general OS. It might be iPhone.
2.5 billion devices. That's across their devices, and they posted a record 143.8 billion in revenue with iPhone sales. New iPhone sales hitting 85.3 billion, which is up 23% year over year. And China, the revenue in China surged 38% as well. So what this is saying is that people are upgrading their phones. There's a double-digit number of people switching from Android to iPhones now. And all of that is driving Apple's growth. So That's a really interesting narrative in this whole security landscape and privacy landscape.
Well, and it's why Tim Cook is in Washington all the time, whispering in the president's ear to make sure that he doesn't mess with China too much. Again, I mean, you just listen to those numbers.
Yeah.
He's got to be there pitching his story about China's not evil.
Fascinating. All right, well, let's wrap it up for here. Great short conversation today, but thanks everybody for listening, and we'll pick it up next time. Thank you
Nice
so
to
much.
see you.
All right. Thanks.
Everybody,
Bye-bye.
take care.